our event. This topic is going to be the Tiered Aquatic Life Uses, or the TALU framework that we have here at the state of Minnesota. Throughout the event, if you could just keep your camera off and mute your microphone, that would be much appreciated. Sorry about this. There we go, technical issues. So we're going to go over the agenda for today's meeting. We're going to have a welcome and introduction. So that's what we're doing right now. We're going to have a presentation by Will Bouchard, and then we will have a question and answer period at the end of the question, or at the end of the presentation. Will is also okay with answering questions throughout his presentation. So the way you can ask the questions is to please use the chat area in the Teams interface. The way you can get to that is there's a bar in the center of your screen. If you click on this little chat bubble, it will pull up the chat in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So feel free to type in a message. We will be moderating the chat area so we can have Will take breaks and answer questions throughout. Like I said, this is the third event that TCU MODAG has hosted. Our previous event was with Pat Bassfield, and if you are interested in watching that event, if you haven't seen it, you can go to the link that Emily is going to be posting in the chat box to take a look at our website, and you'll find it there. Similarly, this presentation will be recorded, and a little bit later in the week, you'll find the link to this presentation too, if you want to share it with others. So a little bit about our presenter today. Will Bouchard is a research scientist with the PCA. He was an adjunct professor at Hamline University and a postdoc researcher at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University before coming to the Pollution Control Agency. His work at the MPCA includes coordinating the implementation of Tiered Aquatic Life Uses, or TALU, the framework, review beneficial use designations, and the development of water quality standards to protect aquatic biota. In 2017, the PCA adopted the TALU framework for streams and rivers, and it shifted Minnesota away from a one-size-fits-all system for protecting aquatic life and restoration to a more refined system. And that's what Will is going to be talking to us today. So Will, if you want to go ahead, I will stop sharing and you can take over.
Okay, let me know if you can't hear me or can't see my screen. Let's see. I should be sharing it. Let me know when that presentation pops up.
You can see the PowerPoint, but it's not.
Okay. I'll run it. All right, is that working?
That is working.
All right. All right, well, thank you. So like Jen said, I'm going to talk about TALU. I've got maybe 35, 40 minutes of material here, so should be plenty of time for questions. And like she said, I'm happy to answer questions as we go, so that we don't have to go, return to some topics that I covered half an hour ago. So I usually start these presentations out with a little bit of background. Was one step. Something just happened there. Can you guys see the presentation?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, I can't see it, but all right. Okay, so and then after talking about water quality standards, I'm going to talk about the TALU framework in general, what it is, and then I'll get into the implications of it, specifically with monitoring and assessment and implementation of this framework. So starting with water quality standards overview. The slide just advanced. Can you see that?
Yep, yes, you're good.
Okay, good. Just making sure. I never know. So water quality standards are a fundamental tool of the Clean Water Act. And when we talk about water quality standards, we're talking about three main questions that we're asking. What and who are we protecting? So, do we want this water body to be usable for drinking water? Do we want to protect the fish and the bugs in the water? So what are we trying to protect? Second, what conditions are protective? So in order for that river to be usable for drinking water, what conditions do we need to maintain so that it's it's usable for that beneficial use? Or what conditions do we need to maintain to protect fish and invertebrates? And then finally, how do we maintain high water quality? And that's anti-degradation. I won't touch on that a whole lot because that's not really affected by the TALU framework. So in Minnesota, we've got 7 beneficial uses ranging from drinking water, aquatic life recreation, industrial use, so forth. The name Tiered Aquatic Life Uses has the word aquatic life in it. So of course, we're talking about class 2 here. So even though the framework only affects part of one of the 7 beneficial use classes in Minnesota, it's really one of the most important beneficial uses. So this is the use that protects the fish, insects, mussels, plants, as well as the ecosystem services they provide. And the reason why it's so important is because it applies to just about every water body in the state, just about every wetland, lake, stream, river in the state. This beneficial use applies. And in many cases, aquatic life is one of the more sensitive beneficial uses. So a lot of the work that we do to protect water quality is driven by the protection of aquatic life. We can divide this class 2, aquatic life and recreation, further. And the first division is by subclass, and these address natural differences in these systems. So are they cold water or warm water? Are we dealing with lakes and streams, or are we dealing with wetlands? So class 2A is for cold water, lakes and streams. 2BD and 2B are both for warm water, lakes and streams, and class 2D is for wetlands. The streams are further divided, so not the lakes or the wetlands, but the streams are further divided into the TALUs, the Tiered Aquatic Life Uses. And there's 3 of these: exceptional, general, and modified. And I'll talk about these in more detail, but I just wanted to provide a little background on the hierarchy of this framework that we have for beneficial uses. So those are the beneficial uses in terms of standards. What conditions are protective. This is probably what most people are familiar with. What do we need to maintain within these systems to protect the beneficial uses? So for fish, warm water fish community, we need to maintain a minimum of 5 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen as a daily minimum. These are usually statewide, or some cases are region specific, or even site specific. And they can be narrative or numeric. And then there's anti-degradation. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but this basically protects water quality that is better than the minimum. So if we need to maintain 5 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen, let's say we have a stream that has 6, well, anti-degradation has provisions in it that try to maintain that 6 rather than allowing it to be whittled down to that 5. So the Tiered Aquatic Life Use Framework, it largely refines the beneficial uses, but that then has impacts on the standards that apply to those beneficial uses. And when we talk about aquatic life uses, and TALU in particular, a lot of the standards that we're talking about are biological standards or biological criteria. And I'll provide a little more detail on those in a moment. So how do we use these standards? The beneficial uses, the standards or the criteria, and anti-degradation. They're used as measures or benchmarks. So we go around the state monitoring lakes and streams and wetlands, and we can get a picture of what percentage of our water bodies are meeting or aren't meeting beneficial uses, or when they're not meeting, what the problems are. Now, when there are problems, when we need to restore these waters, or in some cases just protect them, the beneficial uses or the water quality standards are there to serve as controls, and there's also an element of strategy to these. So permit limits, standards are used to determine, how much of a pollutant can be discharged into a water body and still maintain that beneficial use. Anti-degradation review, again, trying to maintain water quality that's better than the minimum. Total maximum daily loads, TMDLs, when it's not meeting, developing that study to bring that water body back into attainment so that you protect or you restore that beneficial use. There's watershed restoration and protection strategies that include the total maximum daily load work, as well as some broader elements to restoring and protecting water quality. And then there's things like pollution reduction strategies, which are even broader than that. These are maybe statewide, like the nutrient reduction strategy, where we're dealing with a widespread stressor. In particular, often something where there's a lot of non-point source types of pollution. So the TALU framework is largely implemented through the Intensive Watershed Monitoring Framework. So this is this framework's on a 10-year cycle. There's 80 watersheds in the state. On average, we monitor 8 of those a year. And of course, many of you are probably involved with many of these steps. And so you're probably familiar with this, but I want to call out where the Tiered Aquatic Life Use Framework is important. So we do the monitoring, we pull all this data together, and the first step we do is a use designation review. And so this is the primary part of this effort is to determine tiered aquatic life uses. What's the highest potential biological use that a water body can attain? And this is important because assigning that different TALU defines the biological community we expect to find there and impacts the biocriteria which apply, and therefore impacts the assessments. So impacts whether or not we determine these waters are meeting or aren't meeting the aquatic life use goals, and whether or not that beneficial use is being protected. And of course, then that information feeds into the watershed restoration protection strategies, as well as the actual action that's done on the ground to protect and restore the water. So it's important that we get this use designation right. We set our goals, our objectives for what this biological community should look like and what it can attain. We want to set that correctly, because if we don't, that could lead to potential errors, down the road. So before I get into the TALU framework in a little more detail, I just want to put bounds on where it applies. So it applies to flowing water courses, streams, rivers, ditches. Doesn't apply to lakes or wetlands, although that's not a fundamental reason. It's just we haven't developed tools for it. So someday we could have TALU for lakes and wetlands. It only applies to perennial systems, some intermittent waters as well. And this is not to do with the applicability of TALU to that, the concept in general, but more to the biological tools, the indices of biological integrity, which we use to monitor the health of these fish and macroinvertebrate communities. Those tools are developed for streams that are wetted for a sufficient amount of time to allow colonization of these organisms. So that's another limitation of the framework. And then finally, it doesn't change chemical standards. So chemical standards still apply. The TALU framework doesn't override the application of chemical standards. It doesn't change them, although in the future, the TALU framework might serve as a mechanism to tier chemical standards. So maybe dissolved oxygen should be tiered depending on the TALU aquatic life use, the tiered aquatic life use that's applied to a water body. So historically, we've relied most heavily on chemical and physical standards, dissolved oxygen, ammonia, things that most people are familiar with. I just had my PowerPoint crash on me. All right, maybe it's still working. Can you guys still see it?
We can still see it.
Okay, I don't know what that was. So, but there's been a shift to using more biological standards, and the benefit of this is that we can directly measure aquatic life use goals. So we go out, we actually measure the fish and the invertebrates, from a water body, and and using tools like the indices of biological integrity, it can tell us whether or not those communities are healthy. And the advantage of this is that rather than going and taking a snapshot by grabbing a couple chemical parameters, the fish and bugs are long lived. They incorporate the effects of multiple stressors, so you get this longer period of time that it's essentially documenting if there are stressors within that system. And so we've been doing this for 20, 30 years now at the PCA, and so TALU was sort of the next evolution for the use of these biological standards. Those of you who've worked with biological standards know that there's an additional step, though, that you've got to do with stressor identification. You can't just write a TMDL for smallmouth bass or something like that. You've got to actually do the study after you've identified an impairment to determine what the stressor is. So in Minnesota, we've done a lot of sampling for fish and macroinvertebrates. The map on the left shows you the number of sites that we've sampled as of about 5 years ago. So we understand a lot about how these biological communities differ naturally between, say, a cold water stream and a warm water stream, but we also understand how they change in response to anthropogenic stressors. And we've used that to develop tools like the indices of biological integrity, where we can sample the fish and the invertebrates. We get a score of 0 to 100, 100 being good, 0 being poor. And that tells us about the health of that fish community. So we can take a fish sample, get a score of, say, 70. But then we've got to ask, well, is that a good score? And so we've also developed biological criteria, which are based off of looking at a set of benchmark sites that have healthy communities. What is the typical score for a biological community from those healthy sites? And so in the case of a 70, that would meet. We're doing fine with that fish community. Score of 52 or 32 is not meeting. And so just like exceeding the dissolved oxygen standard, this would result in this fish community being listed as impaired, requiring a study to determine what the stressors are, and then restoring the water body in order to bring that fish community back above at least to that 50. Now, this is what our framework looked like before we adopted TALU. It's basically a pass-fail, but there's a lot of space on either side of that 50. And so what TALU does is it looks at these diverse systems across the state, things like the Brule River, which has a fish and macroinvertebrate community that's close to natural and undisturbed. It's in a watershed that has very little human disturbance. But so it's doing closer to that 100 than it is, and so it has the potential that it could be degraded all the way down to that 50 before it would trigger an impairment listing and actions to restore it. The Wild Rice River, that's a little bit above the 50. So that one probably fits okay with our previous framework. And then we have systems like County Ditch 34, which it's a ditch, it's maintained for drainage. It doesn't have the habitat to support the same types of fish community that you'd see in a natural channel stream like the Wild Rice River. And so it's legally altered. That legally altered habitat is what's limiting the attainment of the biology. It's not necessarily a chemical stressor. It's the habitat that's the result of this legacy legal activity. And so what the Tiered Aquatic Life Use framework does is provide more options. So there's an exceptional use now for these high quality waters so that we can identify those and lock those in and start to develop strategies for protecting them and maintaining that higher water quality. The general use is equivalent to our old framework. That's the minimum that the Clean Water Act requires. And then there's the modified use, which sets a lower biological goal for legally altered systems where habitat is what's limiting the attainment of the biology, and so its potential is below that of a natural channel stream. And there's biological criteria that go with these tiers. In addition to that, there's stream types. So there's 9 different IBI models each for fish and macroinvertebrates. The stream types deal with the natural differences between these systems, because you don't want to compare a northern cold water stream fish community to that of a southern river. So there's different expectations for the types of fish, as well as the composition of those communities in terms of biological metrics between these different stream types. But in addition to that, we have different tiered aquatic life use biocriteria. And so there's exceptional use criteria, general use, and then modified use, at least for some of the stream types. There's no modified use for rivers or cold water streams, because these systems tend not to be ditched as often. And even when they are ditched, they often demonstrate an ability to at least meet that general use. So these are the criteria that we use to determine whether or not we have a healthy or unhealthy fish community or macroinvertebrate community. Are they meeting our biological standards, or are they not? To compare these standards on a gradient of biological condition, high being that blue portion of the plot. These are essentially natural communities, undisturbed, all the way down to low, highly degraded communities that really don't provide much in the way of ecosystem services. So the exceptional use is there toward the top. Again, these are really high quality, nice, close to natural systems, and they tend to be in areas where there's not a lot of human activity, as you might expect. The general use is a step down from that. These are still fairly healthy communities, at least functionally. Most of the function is there. You might have lost some of your sensitive species. You might have had a shift from sensitive species to tolerant species, but functionally it's still a fairly healthy system. So it's still a good system. And then the modified use is a step down from that. And at this point, you are losing the function of that community. You've lost more of the species. And this is basically what you see in a system when you remove a lot of the habitat, where you don't have that habitat diversity to support the same diverse fish or macroinvertebrate community you'd find in a natural channel stream. And those tiers, the fish communities, change as you move down through that step. As you increase the amount of stress, the species shift along that. You shift from certain species disappear, some are added. You usually move toward a population that has more omnivores in it, fewer sensitive species, more tolerant species, usually fewer species in general. So these communities change in a more or less predictable way. So the way that we use these tiered aquatic life uses, so let's say we have an exceptional use stream, and we designate exceptional, and then it gets degraded. Something happens to it. We sample it 1 year, we come back in 10 years, and now it's no longer meeting that exceptional use goal. Under our old framework, because it's still above that general use bar in the middle, it would be okay. It would still be meeting that general use goal, but because it's been designated as an exceptional use under the TALU framework, it now becomes impaired and it needs to be restored. So that triggers a stress for identification and TMDLs if they're appropriate to try to restore that fish community back up to that exceptional use goal. Same is true of the general use of the modified use. If they're meeting the general use of the modified use and they slide down below those goals, they become impaired. So these ditches, aren't just written off as saying, well, it's a ditch, it can't support anything. It still has a goal that it needs to meet. So they need to be restored back above that line. Now, although these uses can't go down, they can go up. So hopefully, the idea with this system is they can't go down. If they go down, they got to be restored. But if they go up, then that becomes the new use. So a general use that moves to exceptional, well, now we lock in that new higher use. So over time, we improve the biological quality of these systems and lock that in. But it's important that at the time we can recognize, what is the biological potential of these systems now.
Hey, Will.
Yep.
Excuse me, there's a question. And so it says, if a modified use stream is left alone long enough, it could support general use species and be reclassified. Could it support general use species and be reclassified as a general use? So I think you just answered that. But the follow-up is, if so, how then does that sync with the property owner's legal right to quote unquote maintain a ditch, which could reduce it back to the modified use goal?
Right. So that's something that we're trying to figure out what we can do. I mean, certainly if it's left long enough, these systems are going to recover, and in many cases they may end up meeting the general use, and that would probably trigger the designation of a general use, because we've demonstrated that it can meet that general use. That's just the way the Clean Water Act works. It doesn't give us, we don't have the authority to say, no, you can't go and clean out that system, because the Clean Water Act, Minnesota rules, just they don't carry that authority. So the long-term strategy needs to be trying to identify ways that when we have a ditch that recovers to the point where it can support a general use community, how do we promote that? I mean, and it's not going to happen overnight, but there's work being done to look at things like two-stage ditches. Are there different ways we can manage these water bodies so that we maintain that drainage benefit, which is it's not going away for a large part of the state, but how do we maintain that drainage benefit while also promoting improved water quality, improved aquatic life? And it gets tricky because it's also probably going to need to be beneficial to the landowners as well. You can't just lay a whole bunch of additional costs on them. So I've been in a number of conversations, thinking about how do we manage these systems differently? What technologies can we use to maintain them so that when we've identified a system that's a ditch that can support a general use? We want to know about those systems, because there's something about those systems that have recovered that tells us, maybe we can manage this ditch for both the drainage benefit and for aquatic life. All right, so how do we actually determine a stream? If we have a stream, which of these three bins does it belong to? So the primary, or at least the initial piece of evidence that we look at is the biology. So if we go and we sample a stream and it meets the exceptional use for the fish and the macroinvertebrates, then we could designate it as an exceptional use, because we've demonstrated that exceptional use is attainable because it's currently being met. The same is true for the general use. So if it doesn't meet the general use, then we ask, does it meet the general use at least? If the answer is yes, then we would designate a general use. And so there are ditches out there that do meet the general use. Some cases, yes, they have been left for many, many decades and not maintained, and they recover. But there are ditches out there that just have good habitat and good biology. They have good substrates in them. Even though they might be straight as an arrow, they still support good biology. And this is really what's required by the Clean Water Act. We can't just blanket call every ditch a modified use and set a lower goal. We have to demonstrate whether or not that use is attainable. And if the biology is meeting, then that's an indication that use is attainable. And these are the biological criteria that we use to compare against. So these criteria aren't just used in the assessment process, they're also used as part of the use designation process. So if we have a stream that doesn't at least meet that general use, so either the fish or the macroinvertebrates or both of these assemblages don't meet the general use, then that's triggering this formal use attainability analysis to determine what's the highest use that this water can attain. So the first question there is, are the biological communities limited by legally altered habitat? In most cases we're talking about, is this a system that's maintained for drainage? Is there a direct modification to the channel itself? The answer is no. There's, it's a natural channel stream, and it's not meeting the general use. It's probably got some sort of chemical pollutant, maybe altered hydrology, that's preventing it from meeting the general use at the time it was sampled. And so it would be designated as a general use. There might be ditches that have good habitat here. And so a ditch with nice substrates and macrophytes that, even though the biology may not be meeting the general use, has habitat that our models predict it should be at least meet that general use. And so that sort of system would also go into the general use. If the answer is yes, the biology is limited by this legally altered habitat. So it's legally maintained for drainage. It's a ditch. It's got poor biology, and that habitat is limiting the biology. Then we ask, is it an existing use or is it feasibly attainable? And I'll provide some examples of this in a moment, but the existing use has a very specific definition under the Clean Water Act. It's whether or not a use was attained on or after November 28, 1975. What this means is if a ditch was created after that date, after 75, then it can't be a modified use because it was a general use. It was a natural channel stream before that date. So in that case, we would designate it as a general use. Or feasibly attainable, is it restorable? An example of this might be a long stream channel, maybe 10 miles long. You've got a small section of, a tenth of a mile that's ditched. Well, that might be something that's restorable because you have this relatively small section with this otherwise natural stream section. But if the answer is no to those, then we could designate a general use. So we've got to go through this process of reviewing the highest attainable use for these waters because US EPA gets to approve whether or not these use changes are okay. And because the modified use is below the Clean Water Act minimum goal, it's got to go through this use attainability analysis and the EPA has got to approve it. And these are some of the requirements of that review.
Hey, Will, we have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So to clarify, if they meet the fish and not the macro standard, then it doesn't meet the use. It has to meet both.
Right. So either way, if we go back to this step here, so in order to be an exceptional use, it's got to meet both the fish and the macroinvertebrates, and the same here to get designated to the exceptional use here. So the no could be either of the assemblages. It just takes one assemblage it's really fundamental to the reason why we have these two assemblages. We're not doing it to be redundant. We're doing it because they tell us different things about the community, and in some cases there may be factors that limit one biological community and not the other, and so it may not be appropriate to assign a general use to a ditch where the fish meet but the bugs don't, because the bugs might be the community that's limited by the habitat in that system. And we'd basically be spinning our wheels trying to get that bug community to meet that general use in the ditch because it's limited by the fact that it's maintained for drainage.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, here's just some examples of general uses. I mean, these are waters that are modified. The top row, these are modified systems where the biology meets the general use goals. So these are general use. We have on the sites down the bottom, the biology doesn't meet, but these modified systems have pretty good habitat. The habitat assessment that we've done indicates that despite being maintained for drainage, it still has good habitat within those systems. So these would be general uses. Here's same sort of thing, a couple of ditches. They're straight as an arrow, but they've got nice substrates, good macrophytes. The habitat assessment says these things should be able to meet that general use. That restorable step, here's an example of a stream down in the southeast. The line going through the middle here, that's red and green. The green is natural channel systems, reaches that aren't modified. The red are modified sections. The blue circles with the yellow cross are biomonitoring stations. We sampled this reach on those modified sections, but in general, the stream reach is mostly natural. We do have some short reaches that are altered, but under the Clean Water Act, these would be viewed as potentially restorable because they're relatively short and not representative of the entire reach. Here's an example of that existing use that I mentioned. So the photo on the left is photo taken around the time this site was monitored. Most of that stream channel is altered. It's straight, but if we look back at some photos from 1976, it had a natural channel, and so the existing use is a general use because on November 28th, 1975, it had a natural channel and therefore wouldn't have been eligible for a modified use. This is our more typical sort of modified use. I mean, those red lines are all ditches in the straight trapezoidal systems, and with a lot of the watershed being altered. So here's a map of the state showing you where some of these different uses might be. This is a preliminary determination. The final determinations all need to go through rulemaking, and I did this a few years ago, so we have more data now, but it gets the picture across. Most of those exceptional uses, those blue lines, are up in the northeast, some in the southeast, some in the St. Croix Basin. Most of the modified uses are in the prairie region or up in the Lake Agassiz Plain. So areas where there's a lot of ditching, there's a lot of agriculture, and also in urban areas. So what are some of the implications of adopting this tiered aquatic life use framework? With the exceptional uses, right now the focus is protection. Because it requires a determination that these waters meet these exceptional uses, so far they all meet that beneficial use. So we don't have any impaired exceptional uses yet. Maybe down the road, maybe 10 years down, when we revisit some of these sites, we may start finding some that need to be restored. But for now, we need to think about, how do we maintain this higher water quality in these water bodies? And the other thing is, we've just started doing this. TALU was adopted in 2017. We've only adopted about 40% of or TALUs for about 40% of the watersheds. So we're still going around the state trying to find these waters so that we can start to develop plans to protect them. But ultimately, the protection will largely be implemented through RAPs, anti-degradation, and site-specific standards. But for the Twin Cities, there's probably not a whole lot of implications for this. These are typically found in areas where there isn't a lot of human activity. Probably the closest exceptional uses will likely be found in some of these cold water streams that are in the St. Croix River Valley. Modified uses probably have more implications for the Twin Cities. One of the big implications for adopting this is that there won't be as many impaired waters. So there are waters that would be designated as a modified use, which under our old framework would have been listed as impaired, because in order to get into the modified use, you have to not be meeting that general use. So some of these modified uses are going to meet that modified use. They won't go in the impaired waters list, whereas they would have, 5 years ago. So that's one impact. A good chunk of those modified uses are still going to be impaired. It's not a, sweep these things under the rug type of thing. They're still impaired, but it sets attainable goals. So the expectations for the biological community that you're going to find in these modified uses are not a natural channel stream with a lot of habitat diversity. It's, what does a healthy, quote unquote ditch look like? I touched on this already from the question I got earlier, but how do we protect channelized streams that meet the general or modified use? We don't have the regulatory authority. We don't have the carrot or the stick really to do anything about this yet. But so we need to think of ways that are mutually beneficial for landowners, that in many cases are going to maintain that drainage, but can also protect and improve water quality. In addition, there hasn't been a whole lot of focus on ditches. I think, many people view a ditch and they think, well, that's a ditch that's there for moving water. It's not there for aquatic life or water quality or anything like that. So there hasn't been a whole lot of focus on doing that, even though the PCA, we've been monitoring and assessing ditches going back 25 years now. So it's not new. It's just, it might take a shift in thinking. But what I've seen, at least anecdotally, I haven't done a comprehensive analysis of this yet. But for the most part, when you find a modified use ditch that meets those biological criteria, it also meets the chemical criteria that apply to it. And when you find a ditch that doesn't meet that modified use goal, they often have some sort of chemical problem, some kind of sort of chemical pollutant that's likely causing that non-attainment. So the problems in these systems, whether it's a natural channel stream or a ditch, are in many cases the same. And so the solutions are going to be the same. Although, like I said, we probably need to think about ways that manage these systems in a way that promotes water quality while maintaining that drainage benefit. Here's just some examples of some modified uses. Here's some full support. Here's some non-support. Maybe they look fairly similar, but like I said, when you start delving in, often chemically they will look different. Here's just an example from a watershed where over 3/4 of the stream miles are altered. So a lot of this watershed in the South Fork Crow is ditched. Under our old framework, that green wedge at the top, the general use full support, those are the only stream reaches that would have met the biological criteria. The adoption of TALU, now we add that yellow wedge on the bottom right corner. Those are meeting goals, and so they wouldn't go on the impaired waters list for biology. There's still plenty of other problems, obviously. There's still plenty of non-support reaches, but we can think about where we focus our efforts. Rather than trying to make a ditch perform biologically the same as a natural channel stream, we can focus those efforts on ditches that aren't even performing well as a ditch, as well as those general use, those natural channel streams that aren't meeting goals. So in terms of how TALU affects monitoring and assessment, if you've been working on monitoring and assessment and partnering with the PCA for a while, it doesn't change a whole lot. The TALU framework was designed to work within the existing monitoring and assessment framework. Maybe the biggest thing is we might need to do some additional monitoring to resolve some of these use designations. Again, we want to make sure we assign the right TALU to a stream before we get to that assessment, because again, if we get that TALU wrong, we might be setting the wrong objectives, and that's going to impact the determination of whether or not it's meeting those objectives and what we do to try to protect or restore that system. Any changes to TALUs, just like changing any other use designation, requires a formal rulemaking. Right now, we're working on doing these every 2 years. So we just completed a rule for the watersheds that were assessed in 2016 and 2017. That's the map on the right there. We're starting work on use designations, which is going to include TALUs for the watersheds that were assessed in 2018 and 19. So every 2 years, we're gonna keep adding these TALU designations to rule. The 2018, 2019 will represent the 5th and 6th assessment years that we've done. So with a 10-year cycle, even though we've completed the first IWM cycle, we've only so far gone through 4 of those years. And we're just starting on the 5th and the 6th years to review for TALU. As with most of the work that we do at the PCA, there's local partners. Many of you are probably very involved with a lot of what I'm talking about here, and monitoring, assessment, actually implementing water quality projects. A lot of that is local partners. It's not the PCA. And so with that, we want feedback on these use designations, on these TALUs, because local partners often know more about these systems or have information that we don't have. And so opportunities to do that would be through the professional judgment group meetings where we talk about the assessments. So this, it's not just the assessments that are on the table. It would also be the use designations that the PCA staff are recommending. There's opportunities to comment during rulemaking, whether it's formal or informal. And there's also, some watersheds have requested additional meetings to specifically talk about use designations. They want to talk about, what the PCA is recommending before we actually get to the rule or the professional judgment group meetings. So we usually finish up our use designation determinations in late fall in order to prepare for the assessments in winter. So some watershed groups want to talk to us between then. They want to have time to really focus on these. And some that we've asked, they don't. So it's up to the watershed groups or agency to ask if they want to talk more about this. We don't want to waste people's time. We want to be conscious of that. But I would say that the sooner we talk about this, the easier it is to make changes if we're convinced that these things, our recommendation isn't correct. So just to summarize this framework, one of the big things it does is it identifies these exceptional use waters, these high quality waters. We're still, like I said, going around trying to find these waters and still developing the strategies to protect them. So, there's still plenty of work to do, but this is one of the big goals of the Tiered Aquatic Life Use framework is to protect these waters so that we don't have to try to fix them down the road, particularly after things like infrastructure have been put in and are causing that degradation of the water. The modified uses set attainable goals largely for these systems that are maintained for drainage. What this means is that some of the ditches that would have been impaired under our old framework are not anymore, so they won't be listed. Those that don't meet those goals, we are setting attainable restoration goals, reasonable goals, in line with what you can achieve within a system that's maintained for drainage. But, like I said, we're just starting to work on this. We've only had TALU in place for about 3 years, so we're still working on developing tools to manage ditches. When that drainage function needs to be maintained, when that benefit needs to be maintained, how can we promote water quality, for that reach and for downstream waters? And finally, for all the steps that with water quality management, whether it's monitoring, assessment, and use designations, it's important that the local partners are involved in that in order for the implementation. Hi, sorry, my microphone cut out there. I don't know how much you lost there.
Pretty much since you got to the question slide.
Okay, well, that's good. Then I'm all done.
So I guess we can open this up for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type it into the chat area on the right-hand corner of the screen. Thank you very much, Will.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great presentation.
Well, always happy to talk about TALU.
So I actually do have a question. When you are evaluating streams, are you going out to monitor like during the 2 years that the others are collecting the water chemistry for the watersheds? And is that, go ahead.
Oh, a quick answer, it's usually a single year, although there may be follow-up sampling that's done. So the biological sampling is typically intended to be a single year. And
just out of curiosity, if that year tends to be like a drought or a high water year, how do you guys handle that?
Well, first thing we try to do is avoid that. But if we do, I mean, that's part of the review of the biological data. There's a number of steps before we get to that, even that use designation step. So that's after the monitoring, you know, we look at the data, and if we want to identify any data that was collected during atypical periods or was collected at, say, very high flow or very low flow, and that may result in that data being flagged as not being usable for the process of assessment or for the use designation process. At the very least, if it has anything that's anomalous, it, you know, would be flagged as you know, treat this information with caution because the conditions may not have been appropriate. So what that may mean is that there may be a second year of sampling if for a subset. There's always a subset of sites that we end up revisiting in a watershed because of problems the previous year with things like flows.
So we have another question here. You mentioned that TALU could be used to tier chemical standards. Dissolved oxygen is a good example. How far is the PCA on this, and where is it heading?
Well, so I've got in my mind that, you know, one of my tasks that has no timeline on it right now is to look at dissolved oxygen, because I think dissolved oxygen is something that is probably due for being revisited. And some of the obvious situations are, well, I mean, if you look at many ditches, they're often low gradient systems, and so they're going to have lower dissolved oxygen. So maybe you don't need 5 milligrams per liter to support a modified use community. There's also natural classification. So with those different IBI models, there's a low gradient class. So those low gradient classes may naturally have lower dissolved oxygen and a biological community that is adapted to that. So there may need to be not just a tiering based on the TALU tiers, but also a tiering based on the natural classification of those systems. And you know, I've got 3 other rules that I'm working on right now. So, you know, I don't know when I'll get to dissolved oxygen, but it probably won't get started for a couple of years, and that whole process takes many years. So I'd say at least 5 years out, and it just depends. I know it's something that staff at the PCA have expressed interest in doing, and so it's been on my mind. I just we don't have enough people to do everything that needs to be done. So
I'm gonna give some time just in case there's any other follow-up questions.
sure.
Okay, I think, oh, well, thank you, Sarah. Do you ever use biological sampling already completed by local organizations?
To a limited extent, we do. We have used some data. The issue is making sure that the data is collected using the standard methods, you know, using the protocols that we have. And so that's something we've talked about. You know, how do we do that? How do we provide some sort of like a certification program for other monitoring programs so that we can use that data? I mean, we certainly, if other programs have collected that data, we want it, and we'll often use that at least as supplemental data. Whether or not we can be confident that it's assessment level data, you know, data we're confident on hanging our hats on an impairment on, that's the question. And so if there are groups out there that want to do that, then, you know, we like to talk about that. We've had some contractors, you know, sort of get, I don't know if certified, but it's been sort of an ad hoc approach. But a place like Ohio, they do have a certification program for external groups collecting data so that they can use it. And I think it would be a great thing if we could figure out how to do it. So so the short answer is yes, we do to a limited extent, and I wish we could use more of it. But there needs to be some way to certify that that information.
All right. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. It is now 2 o'clock. Again, thank you so much, Will. This was a fantastic presentation. And thank you all for attending. We will see what happens in the future about TC Remote Ag webinars. But keep a look in your inbox because we might be sending a survey out just to gauge the community's interests in the previous webinars and then potential future topics. So thank you very much for attending and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.